Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to this event and thank our panelists. We're honored to have Dr. Nader Hashemi from DU's own Corbell School of International Studies, Dr. Damian Bassage from San Jose State University, and then Professor Wael from American University in Cairo. My name is Michael Fleschner. I'm a Master's of Finance student at Daniels College of Business. I'm the campus leader for Crossroads Cultural Center, and I'm happy to have you all here. And along tonight with the Middle East Discussion Group is helping to co-sponsor this event, and the title of the event is The Arab Spring Reconsidered, A Question of Freedom. Crossroads Cultural Center was established in New York in 2004 by a few members of Communion and Liberation, which is an international movement in the Roman Catholic Church. The goal of Crossroads is to offer opportunities for education, that is, to make it possible to look with openness, curiosity, and critical judgment at every aspect of reality. Our motto is, to take the suggestion of St. Paul, test everything, retain what is good. Thus, we want to encounter people from all walks of life, and to look at and appreciate everything that is true, good, and worthwhile in the various expressions of human life, including arts, science, politics, religion, history, and economics. At the 2012 New York Encounter, an annual cultural festival held by Crossroads in New York, Professor Farouk spoke of the human need for dignity, freedom, and the unexpected consequences of the human heart. This is why we want to know more about the Arab Spring, and we are confident that tonight's panelists can help us in the journey of knowledge. And if you'd like to know more about Crossroads, please fill out your cards and hand them to the people at the table in the back. And then also, our moderator this evening, Dr. Damian Bassage, an educator, translator, and author who has been affiliated with Crossroads since its inception in 2004. In addition to his academic research, which focuses on the legacy of humanism in the Mediterranean and the Americas, he has written articles on history, politics, and contemporary culture for publications such as Traces Magazine and Páginas Digital in Spain. He holds a PhD in Hispanic Languages and Literatures from the University of California, Los Angeles. He is on the faculty of the Department of World Languages and Literatures at San Jose State University in California. And I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Bassage.
Back. All right, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Once again, I'm honored to be here, and more than anything, I'm honored to be here with our two guests tonight. In 2010, a fire was lit in Tunisia that began to spread all over various parts of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, which have, for better or worse, come to be collectively known as the Arab Spring. And I know our guests may have their own views on whether that moniker is correct. But for myself, and I know for many of us, it's something that captured our imagination. It captured our imagination as human beings, because we saw in some way reflected in those demonstrations, in those movements, in those uprisings, our own hopes and fears. Our own hopes and fears for the future, our hopes and fears for what human society can be, what the makeup of the world we live in is going to be. And I'm convinced that especially those hopes, are tied to our nature as human beings, are tied to our nature as beings searching for fulfillment, searching for an ultimate horizon. Beings with a heart, in other words. And so tonight, I'm particularly interested to hear the presentations of these two gentlemen, because we want to understand better, what is it that's happening? What is it how do these events speak to us? What is their origin? How do they derive from the experience of the people there who've expressed a desire for something that in some way reflects what we all desire? So what we'll do tonight is I'll introduce our first speaker, and then our second speaker, then we'll have time, hopefully we'll have time for some question and answer, time for conversation. I understand that, We're on a college campus, and students and faculty are busy, got a lot of places to go, and have carved out time from their schedule to be here, so we'll try and keep within our time limits so that it can be useful and interesting for everyone. So let me first present our first distinguished speaker, Dr. Nader Hashemi, whom I understand needs very little introduction on this campus. He's assistant professor here at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and he has been visiting assistant professor and global fellow at the UCLA International Institute. He was the Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University and research affiliate at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. He teaches courses including Introduction to Middle East and Islamic Politics, Islam and Democracy in the Middle East, Religion and State in Comparative Perspective, and Modern Islamic Political Thought. And I also want to mention that Dr. Hashemi has a recent book out through Oxford University Press, Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy, and the paperback is just about to come out. So hopefully what you'll hear tonight will pique your interest. Dr. Hashemi, we've asked him to give us a little bit of background, of context, of what is this movement that we, as I mentioned, have come to call the Arab Spring. And our second speaker, whom I'll introduce after Dr. Hashemi talks, will give us more of a personal experience of what happened on the ground in Cairo. So without further ado, let me pass the microphone over to Dr. Hashemi.
I'll use the signature here. So that's how we do this. Okay, thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to apologize in advance. I just got back from a trip to Europe, which means my body clock is about 2 o'clock in the morning, so if I'm not as coherent as I'd like to be, you'll know why. My task tonight was announced to give you some context, background, to situate, contextualize the Arab Spring. And I think there's a popular sentiment that's out there that the Arab Spring, the euphoria, the enthusiasm that existed about a year ago, a year and a half ago with respect to the Arab Spring has waned. You often hear this claim that the Arab Spring has turned into an Arab winter. The hopes and desires for a democratic transition seem not to be on the horizon. Benjamin Netanyahu has described the Arab Spring as an Islamic, anti-Western, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and anti-Israel wave. If you go to right-wing Republican websites or political analysis, you see similar descriptions of the Arab Spring. And of course, the big issue and the big sort of cause for concern, which I think is a legitimate one, but I think it's exaggerated, is the results of the recent elections that have taken place in Egypt and in Tunisia. The rise of political Islamist parties who've done overwhelmingly well. People are asking, how could this happen? We thought this would be a transition like 1989. But it seems not to be happening. We need a separate lecture here just to do with the question of political Islam, why it's popular. I think Egyptians and Tunisians are voting very rationally. I predict that if all of you had lived the life of a typical Egyptian or Tunisian, you too would have been voting the way that they have. And so I think the real explanation would have been if secular liberal parties had won the elections in Tunisia and Egypt. That would have required sociological and political analysis, not the results that we've just seen. And so I'm happy to sort of entertain that question and expand upon it more during the Q&A session. But I think it's accurate to say that 14 months into the Arab Spring, the region is still in the throes of a momentous and unpredictable transformation. Notwithstanding the loss of life and the deeply unscrupulous and entrenched nature of many political regimes in the Arab Islamic world, Muammar Gaddafi's demise after the overthrow of Mubarak in Egypt and Ben Ali in Tunisia means that 3 of the longest-standing rulers, the longest-standing dictators in the Muslim world who collectively were in power for about 95 years are now gone, and that 100 million Arabs, the collective population of Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, for the first time in their lives, has a reasonable chance of a democratic future. As one prominent Middle East scholar has put it, that the year 2011 is to the Arabs what 1989 was for the communist world. The Arabs are now coming into ownership of their own history, and we have to celebrate this fact. But of course, the analogy with 1989 is deeply problematic because it sort of sets up these false expectations. That in the same way that Europe, Eastern Europe, made a quick transition, smooth transition to democracy, the Arab world should be able to do so as well. And we're seeing that that's not happening, and that's completely understandable. Primarily because, if you think about it, the history of the Arab Islamic world is very different than the history of Eastern Europe. Not only is there a struggle for a transition to democracy, but the big question of how to resolve the normative role of religion in politics has yet to be democratically negotiated. In Tunisia, it is being democratically negotiated. I think things are headed on the right track, but the analogy with Eastern Europe is deeply problematic. It's a very different case. Also because the socioeconomic underpinnings of Eastern Europe were very different than the case of the Arab world. What I want to do here is sort of draw upon some of the ideas of one of my favorites of analysts and writers of the Middle East, Rami Khouri, who's a syndicated columnist. He has a center for, an Issam Ferris Center at the American University of Beirut. I think he's provided some of the best and introspective analysis of the Arab Spring to date. I strongly recommend, if you're interested in understanding the Arab world, Google Rami Khouri's name, bookmark his website, get on his email list server. He provides a very cogent and succinct analysis. And in one of his pieces, he I think accurately noted that we are witnessing today the culmination of a century of Arab popular struggle for freedom, dignity, and democracy. That struggle was interrupted by many decades of illusionary statehood under the reign of autocrats who were enthusiastically supported, not all of them, but many of them, by foreign powers. Today's struggle is the single most important movement of Arab citizens and citizenries since the modern Arab world was created in the 20th century. That world was born amid revolts against the Ottoman Empire and European imperial powers. When the European imperial powers finally retreated, they left behind a collection of Arab countries that they essentially had manufactured for their own convenience out of their particular former colonial dominions. 22 nominally sovereign Arab states ultimately emerged, and they lived in the 21st century battered and bruised by a combination of forces. Their own economic mismanagement and corruption, regional wars and occupations involving Israel, Iran, and recurring invasions by the United States and Britain, severe economic disparities resulting in the misuse of oil and gas wealth, and a stunning record of sustained autocracy and authoritarianism, unmatched perhaps by any other region in the world. Now Arab societies are today finally being born of their own volition, rather than through the false birth of some self-serving European colonial official. The momentous process that is underway today is so complex and was so long in the making that it's not surprising, as was mentioned, that we have a difficult time coming up for a proper name for this event. Is it the Arab Spring? Should we call it a revolution? Thawra? You sometimes hear the term Intifada, uprising. You often hear the term Arab Renaissance or Arab Awakening. 14 months into the Arab Spring, that really was marked by the overthrow of Tunisia's long-standing dictatorship and the Mubarak regime. Two important patterns have emerged according to Rami Khouri. First, there is a common set of basic material and political grievances that citizens in most Arab societies share. Since each country's response to the protests have been determined by the intersection of two factors. Number one, the nature and the legitimacy of the regime itself, and the intensity of popular grievances. This is why the region is marked by a variety of revolts and different regime responses. And so it's one of the problems with the term Arab Spring sort of presupposes that the entire region is a monolith. This is one of the big sort of Orientalist myths about discussing the Arab Islamic world, thinking that it's all exactly one particular monolithic whole when it's not. There have been to date 3 regime changes. While there's active warfare and low-intensity conflict, and of course the most intense sort of battleground place that we've all been watching is the case of Syria. In other Arab countries, the national leadership, perhaps feeling that they are on firmer ground, are attempting to mute demands for change with a combination of massive cash handouts to their hardworking and disgruntled populations, while simultaneously offering an olive branch to their opposition, say that we will engage in reform, we will engage in dialogue, and this is the basic policies that have characterized those countries that have yet to see, and I emphasize the word yet to see, an uprising: Algeria, Jordan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and many of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. Understanding what is happening now and how things might evolve requires above all grasping the nature of the grievances that have caused people to come into the streets.